Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators. We also honor people who honor creators. And today we have Carrie Sweet on our show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Carrie has been a super fan of some of the podcasts. Name some of the podcasts you chat in.
I pretty much anything that Bill Rill and RFM are on, I'm a follower.
You occasionally watch Mormon Stories and
I
comment?
was obsessed with Mormon Stories for a long time, and I just have to apportion my time because I'm a mom and I have a full-time job and I'm a wife. So
That's right. And we have a surprise ending to the show. And so stick around and wait for the surprise. So Carrie, tell us a little bit about your upbringing, like where you lived and what your experience was like in the church and as a youth in general.
Sure. So my mother was a convert. My parents were converts. So I wasn't born under the covenant, but I was born into Mormonism. Basically, I was a couple months old when my mom started taking the missionary discussions, and her sister actually turned her on to Mormonism. She had already joined, and this was, back in the 70s. I grew up in the church. My mom was sure that I needed a name and blessing, and so she drug my toddler self up to get a name and blessing when she figured out what that was, and she advocated for that.
And what state or area was this in?
That was we were down in like Central California.
Do you remember the name of the ward?
No,
or the stake?
It was such a rural area around Bakersfield.
Okay.
I remember going to church in a school while they were building the chapel, and we would save our pennies and donate them to the chapel building fund. And so I have that memory. We were all so proud of our chapel when we finally got it.
And then were you around with the primary children hospital fundraising?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay.
So I grew up in the church.
Yeah. And did anybody find out that there's some other prior ancestor used to be a Mormon and dropped out? Or was it all never Mormons in your ancestry?
I am not pioneer stock.
Mm-hmm.
And if my aunt, who is a family history like whiz, she's done so much, she probably has unearthed some pioneers, but it's not part of our like family legacy. Like
That's
so many
right.
people, we were true converts and we went in hardcore.
And what was your experience like as a young woman going to church? What did you think about the programs?
I didn't know anything else, and I did everything. I did the Young Women's Award. I was, the Beehive, in the Beehive presidency, Maya Maid presidency, eventually was Laurel class president, which was an interesting story. Actually, if you want, I'll tell you, it's a quick story. This is when I was 16, we moved to a new ward, and the bishop's daughter was the Laurel class president, and she was great. But the bishop had this policy that every Laurel would be class president. And so he had just put his daughter in as president, and then we moved into the ward. And so to uphold his own policy, he had to release his daughter and call me as Laurel class president. And I had no idea about this. I was just thrilled because I thought, okay, I must be worthy. God wants me to be the Laurel class president. And then when I had my interview with him, he was kind of rude and was like just saying, well, I have to release my daughter and we don't really know you or anything. It's just we're just filling in this checkbox with you. And so that was my first experience.
Was it sort of like, so you better behave?
Yeah, you should just feel lucky because this is just kind of a form. We're just checking this box that you're going to do this before you graduate high school.
So you did not feel like the bishop had power of discernment or that you were anything special because of that?
No. And at that time, I was so super Mormon. I would get up. I had my patriarchal blessing at 12 years old. I was into the deep doctrine. I was reading Mormon doctrine on my own and farms, and I was just really into it.
And you were doing early morning seminary?
Oh, yes. Yep.
If it was rural, did you have a little bit of a drive or not too bad?
No, it was a drive, and it was very early. I can't recall, but like school started, I think the early class was at 7, so I think it was 6 in the morning, 5:30, 5:50. It was very early. I had to drive. It was about 30 minutes to the seminary.
There you
So
go.
we got up very early. I was always very, very tired. And then I was a cheerleader, so we would do games at night, especially basketball season was wild because we had midweek games. Get home,
Get home late.
12 from the
Not
game.
much time to do homework.
Yeah.
Did you do homework during seminary sometimes? Finish up an assignment?
No, I would do it on the bus.
Oh, the bus, right?
Yeah. So that was my first feeling of, that maybe not all the callings are truly inspired. But I was canceled in my patriarchal blessing, like so many people, that you accept every calling. And I also was told to always bear witness, like always bear my testimony at any chance I got. And so I was one of those annoying people on Fast and Testimony, meaning just bearing my testimony all the time.
That's right. Your message from God was to do that. And so you were going to be diligent and bear your testimony. And so as you approach graduation, were you thinking of college or marriage or what?
College wasn't a big push in my family at all. My parents, my mom had been remarried, which was a whole other thing, to be a child of divorce in the church in the 80s and 90s. And so she was remarried to a pretty horrible person. Neither of them had been graduated from college at that time, and it just wasn't a big push. The push was, since I was small, I was going to get married. I was going to get married to a return missionary. And when my mom remarried for a third time, she's not lucky in love. We moved right between my junior and senior year. That's when I became the Royal Class President, and I started questioning a lot of things. And I went to a Christian bookstore because some people had been saying little things. I'm like, that's not true. And I went to a Mormon Christian bookstore. I opened up some history, and I was only 16 or 17. I don't remember what it was, but it was about Joseph Smith. And I just opened it up in the aisle, and I read that he was a polygamist, and I knew that wasn't true.
That's right.
And I
And you wanted to defend the faith, but you didn't. That book was from the devil, right? Satan inspired that book to be written.
Yep. And I was not supposed to read it, but I went in. I was so curious, and the internet really wasn't a thing yet. And I shut that. I had all of the classic responses that people would have, the physical responses to have so much cognitive dissonance in that one moment. I put it back on the shelf. I left, but that started me really questioning. And I ended up getting a non-member boyfriend, which was a whole thing. I got pregnant. I got married at 19. Through that whole process, I had to, I thought I was going to just leave the church.
Right. And back to that for a second. I think I've heard people that have pioneer stock, they all know about polygamy, right? They may have family lore that talks about, well, Joseph did it. But I remember lessons where it said, Joseph Smith looked around the room and said, I've been accused of having 7 wives, but I only see one. And to me, that was, he didn't practice polygamy. And all the pictures, Joseph and Emma, there's never Joseph and some other woman in the same picture. People sometimes say, oh, well, it was easy to find out. It was easy to find out, but they were in books that were anti-Mormon books, right?
Right.
And we were told those weren't true. those were written with bias and they were full of lies.
Not only were they not true, you're asked at every worthiness interview if you're looking at that.
Right. Do you support groups that are against the church? Right. And
So I was questioning really hard, which is normal at that age anyway, even if I hadn't had some of those experiences. And I honestly, Mormonism made me question because some of my life choices at that time. I really thought the second coming was coming. My family was very
to your supply.
Yeah, yes. I really thought we had the giant timeline that showed all of the different events that had happened to bring the second coming, the ones that would be coming.
Signs of the times.
Mm-hmm. And so I didn't anticipate I would be alive after maybe I was 25. And I wanted to be a mom because that is what I was supposed to do.
So you, in a way, were being like Eve. You were like, in order for me to have this experience, I have to sort of do something that's against what Father has told me. But that's what Father also wants. You also want to bring spirits into the world. And so you had this sort of thing. But so you felt like guilty and glad at the same time.
Yeah, but I knew I was sinning.
Uh-huh.
But also, we, as a youth growing up in LDS church, the smallest sin was equal really to the biggest sin. And
That's
so
right.
once I did the smallest sin and had like a little sip of alcohol, I felt so terrible. I was like, well, I've done everything. I'm
I'm already committed. I'm already going to the celestial kingdom. I might as well make the most of it now.
Yes. But I felt so much pressure. I was completely cut out of my world for a space of time. And I wanted desperately to be back in. So I went to the bishop and repented. I was disfellowshipped. I came back.
Because getting married was doing the right thing. You weren't going to be an out of wedlock mother.
Right.
And so now, was there then, you had a never Mormon husband?
Right. He did convert and we went to the temple. I went to the temple and got my endowment, which was something you had to petition for back then. Still, I think it's a lot easier now, but because my husband had to give me permission, he had to be interviewed. I think he was.
Oh, so you got your endowment before?
Several years before we were married in the temple. Mm-hmm.
And before he was a member?
I think, I can't quite remember.
Or he might have been a member, but
I don't think he was a member, but he was very familiar with the church. So I made him go to the primary stuff,
sure,
the kids and everything.
And
but I had
this
extreme call that I needed to get my endowments.
Right. And so he was not like a project, but converting him sort of vanished some of your sins, right?
Yes, I was told by several priesthood holders around that time that through my faith and through like enduring to the end and my sacrifice, my husband would be converted. We would have all the blessings of exaltation. Basically, it was on me through my faith and obedience.
Right. So you were pursuing temple attendance ahead of your husband because that's just what you had to do. You felt that was still part of your repentance process in a way.
Yes. And my hope, if I was righteous enough.
And do you remember what year you went through the temple and got your endowments?
That was, I believe it was, I should have wrote all these down.
That's okay.
I think it was about 20 years ago. I think it was 2002, 2003, around there.
And did you have more children after your first?
Yeah, so I had 2 before I went to the temple and then 3 after that point.
Right. And so the only reason why I bring that up is because my mom's husband, my dad, was a Jack Mormon. He was baptized, smoked and drank, never had more than the Aaronic priesthood. Our family was sort of like a project family in the ward because we didn't really have the good father figure, right?
Absolutely.
And so we might have been mentioned in ward council. And there was no mention, because my mom tried to take us to church. She tried to pay tithing. There was no option for her to go to the temple and take her endowment out, because she had a husband that just needed to get his act together and become an elder and take her to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't until the late 90s that I heard other women in her situation were now going to the temple. They were getting their endowment. Their husbands weren't going to the temple, and they were temple workers. And it was like, wow. But by then my mom had, if you can't beat them, join them, started drinking with my dad. And so wasn't going to church anymore. So that was a shock. Is like, oh, if only that was available to her in the 70s, she could have taken out her endowment, would have made her feel like she was being a good, daughter of God kind of a thing.
And I did, Gina. I felt so righteous. I was walking around with my magic undies, very modest. And when I got pregnant with my third baby, I was in nursing school. I was in the primary presidency. My husband was a Jack Mormon. And I just was like, this is it. I'm doing it. I'm going to get to the celestial kingdom. And I was just thrilled.
Right. So he was a Jack Mormon by your third kid. So that means you had been married in the temple by then.
So we got married. So he had and this is like his story to tell. He's not a member.
Sure.
I think technically, I don't think he ever resigned, but he had a lot of pressure from me since the time we were teenagers, which I've apologized to him for because it was terrible. But he was in the military and was baptized while he was on deployment in the war.
Wow.
And I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled. It didn't really stick very well. But then he did come back from a different deployment. He was deployed a lot. And in 2010, we had 4 kids at that time. That's when we went. And
okay.
Temple. And that was the only time he ever went. But that day was one of my, not anymore. It means something different.
At the time, it was the capstone experience.
I thought,
checked all the boxes.
I was like, finally, my whole family sealed to me.
You have it made. You had decided to go to the nursing school. What jobs had you had prior to that made you think to do nursing school?
Well, I was a fast food restaurant manager.
Okay.
And I was really good at it, and I didn't like it because I wanted to be home with my kids. Mm-hmm. So my then husband, and then I did a lot of different jobs. I did like in-home daycare, anything I could do to really be with my kids as much as possible. But he wasn't into that culture of, you are going to stay home and be the wife and the mother. You need to work. You need to get out that work. Daycare is made for raising kids. So I picked the career I thought would be the most aligned with my values, so I could help people, and a high enough wage that I could work part-time to be with my kids as much as possible. That did not work out. I worked more than full-time my whole career.
There you go.
So that was my thinking.
And so when did you graduate from nursing school?
2006.
And what was your degree? What do they call that degree?
The Bachelor's of Nursing Science.
Bachelor's of Nursing Science. And that makes you qualified to be a what?
At that point, I was qualified to be a registered nurse.
RN, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you had all the things. You had a husband that was sealed to you forever, and you were on the top of the world. You already had your career going. And so in a way, were you looked at sort of sideways? Where were you living when you graduated?
I was living in Florida, and that's where I had been, like, in the primary presidency. I loved those women that were serving with me. I was in primary callings most of the time I was LDS. I always loved the kids. But then I moved over to Eugene right after I graduated.
Good job.
for my then husband got stationed for 2 years in Korea, and I didn't want to go. I had a new baby. I had a baby like a week before I graduated nursing school, and I went to where my family had settled. They had moved from California up to the Eugene area, and that's where I started my nursing career, waiting for him to come back.
So when you say your family, who is there for you?
My mom and my sisters.
Okay, so you could get support from them while your husband was deployed, and so that's pretty good.
And
And
I was
Eugene,
very active in the church there. We all were just thrilled to be together, going to Relief Society together. And
I assume there were more a higher rate of Mormons in the Eugene area than there were in Florida.
yes,
So
much.
closer church, more friends closer to you that you can go do visiting teaching and other things. So what happens after that? So you're on top of the world. Something happens.
Well, we had a really rough go. We got married way too young and really not compatible. And we
struggled to make it work.
Yes. And he is a struggle in general. And I would take those struggles to the bishop. And it took a lot for me to even talk to the bishop. A lot of people like in my family or friends, they would go to the bishop for anything. They need advice about what car to buy. Let's go talk to the bishop. And I was never like that. I kind of shied away from a lot of the priesthood authority, whether I didn't think they were worthy enough, whether I was worthy enough. I didn't always lean onto them. I would pray for myself and fast for myself a lot, but I was considering divorce because there were some very disturbing things that were happening. And the bishop came to my door, and of course he couldn't come in because I was alone at that time. So we had this conversation on the porch, and I was like crying that this is what's happening. I'm devastated. And he was like, sister, you would not believe how many women come to my office with the same issues that you're having, and you need to endure to the end. Suck it up, buttercup.
That's right. Your blessings are based on your ability to endure to the end.
Yep. So I had another family member also counsel me that I reached out to. And so I sucked it up and I stayed married for 20 years.
What year did you get the divorce then?
2018. That's also when I resigned. So I think what you're wanting to know is I was super uber Mormon, and then I wasn't. So I didn't read the CEO's letter until after I left. There was a lot of things that I feel I discovered from the inside out that Mormonism wasn't what it was saying it was. It didn't make sense. And I did not leave because my children had I have a non-binary kiddo, and back I was in Texas when they were really discovering who they were, and we were going through that as a family, and I did not handle it very well. I handled it better than some people, but I'm pretty ashamed about how I handled it.
Right, because church would say they're just going through a phase and they're rebelling, but your medical training would say people are like this. This is what happens during gestation when hormones wave over differently for every person, and they are a real thing. It's not a mental disorder. It's an actual physiological state of being.
And we were living in the Houston area, which is actually where I'm born, at that time. And so it was different than the Mormonism I had experienced in California, like, the overflow of the Utah. But it was kind of refreshing in a lot of ways. There was lots of converts. There was a lot of transplants from Utah to kind of keep in the leadership, to keep it on track. And my child was treated pretty terribly. And I was listening in Relief Society one day. I was one of the only women that actually worked. So that was always an issue. But so many of their children had left activity. And so every Fast and Testimony Sunday, also in Relief Society, we would have our own little Fast and Testimony. And these women that were like 40, 50, 60 would stand up or be seated and cry about their children who no longer came to church.
Wow.
And these are adults. And I knew, I had been in that ward for a few years, so I knew a lot of their stories. And these children that they were crying over were lovely humans that had successful relationships, children, careers. And I could not understand why they were not proud of them and why they cried about this, because they were so great. And I kept thinking about that. I kept thinking about in the frame of my children are so great. And I had really listened to the teaching that Heavenly Father is the perfect example of how to be a parent. And so I wanted to emulate him. But it was such a disconnect when I was hearing that my wonderful, beautiful children, who there's no way that God could not love, were not loved or not accepted. They were broken somehow and needed to be fixed. That didn't mesh up with me. And so I had this, I started to be more of a PIMO, because I'm like, something doesn't work. And it took a couple more years for me to start to apply that to myself. And that was when I was like, that's when I started thinking, this also applies to me. Heavenly Father must love me. And if he loves me more than I love my children, there's no way that he would not let me come back to live with him, because I can't remember, marrow in my bones, or
Well, you had the same problem I did at the Vale.
I was like, there's just no way.
Help me, feed me the words, and I'll just say them. When I die, I'll have perfect memory, but right now, it's not sticking.
So I figured out pretty much without a lot of, because I already had read and listened to like Joseph Smith papers and everything. So I had all this apologist stuff in my head, but I kind of just left it to the side, because when I realized that God, if he was real and if he really was our parent, then most of the stuff that was going on in the Mormon church just could not be from him. So, but I still had this strong conviction, because Mormonism was the only culture I knew. And that was my family. That was my friends. Those are our activities, everything. So,
and you knew the primary program was true.
I loved primary. I'm a lot like Rebecca. I loved the primary songs. I was a chorister for a long time. I did the primary programs. I wrote the primary programs. They probably have them preset now, but.
And did you feel like you were getting inspiration when you were writing the programs?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so did you sometimes go to the temple with a prayer in your heart to be answered, and felt like sometimes you got an answer?
No, never. I went for answers, but I never had any vision.
You just had too big a problem for God to solve. He's like, I don't know. It's up to you.
No, I remember listening, because my brother-in-law had given me like the Joseph Smith papers on tape.
Wow.
Cassette tape. I mean, like 10 years before that, or a few years before that. And I had really, really believed Joseph Smith's promise that anybody that had enough faith could get the same confirmation that he had. And I wanted my vision.
Mm-hmm.
And that never happened. But I left Houston. I took a job in Idaho. And one of my major motivations for moving the family to Idaho was, I'm basically a PIMO at that point. But if I could just get back to the hub of Mormonism and out from like the semi-converted people.
Right. There'll be so many good Mormons there that'll draw you back.
Yes. And I was
There's
like,
still hope for you.
there's still hope. But I got to Idaho and I saw what it looks like to have Mormonism infiltrate like all aspects of your culture and your work. And it was less than a year. No, it was just a little bit over a year. Then that's when I resigned. I resigned the week after my divorce was final.
And what year was that?
2018.
And so you had been PIMO for about 2 years, from 2016 to 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And you were in Idaho. What town in Idaho?
Boise.
Oh, in Boise. So you're in the Boise 63rd Ward or something like that.
Yeah.
And religion, Mormonism permeated everywhere. If you went to any type of institution like a McDonald's or a bank, one of the workers was probably Mormon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so yeah. So otherwise, did you like Idaho? I mean, did you like Boise? I heard in Boise it doesn't snow as much as like Eastern Idaho.
Boise is lovely. I loved it. I lived close to the bike path by the river, and I love the outdoors. I love like target practice.
And like Meridian was growing, and so the whole metropolitan area was booming often.
Mm-hmm. I loved it, but I grew out of being able to live in Boise because of my beliefs and who I am.
It was too much once you decided to resign. So yes, so deciding to resign. So how did you resign? Did you quit Mormon?
I did.
And how long did it take?
It was pretty fast. Only I think maybe a month or two. It was still the same summer.
And you didn't have to have a notarized anything, or was it
right before they changed it because they felt like it was getting so many resignations.
When you resign, how does that make you feel when you get the notice that says, okay, you're out? But did they have a letter that said, but if you ever want to come back and restore your blessings? They didn't. It was just like, okay, goodbye.
Yep. It was like, it's completed. I was pretty happy when it came. I was like, oh, phew. But actually submitting it was a huge deal because I still wasn't quite sure that I wouldn't need that protection to get in. Like, I'm giving up my ceilings and my endowment. And
it'd be like if you had a lottery ticket and they hadn't announced the numbers yet, and somebody said, hey, you should give that lottery ticket to somebody else. You'd think, well, I could, but there's still a chance I could be a millionaire. So maybe I should keep the lottery ticket. So that's like Dumb and Dumber when what's his name, kid Jim Carrey asked the girl if they can ever be a thing, and she says, not in a million, or 1 in a million. So she's like, oh, so I still have a chance.
And that's how it really felt. And so it was very emotional. I was very, very anxious about it, but I did it and no regrets. I really wanted to protect, I wanted to protect my family, and I couldn't get the children off of the rolls because I would have to have actually had my ex-husband cooperate, and he was not cooperative at that point.
Even though he might not have really believed in the church, he just was kind of like, I'm not going to do what you say because you say it.
Right. Well, right. Right. He was very upset, of course, that I was leaving, and he did use the church, which it's fair because I used the church against him for 20 years, and then he used it against me. Like, how dare you break up our family?
He's finally playing the card that you dealt him.
Mm-hmm. But he didn't know I was leaving. I didn't want to. I didn't
you're
want
an example
about religion in my divorce. So I just didn't say anything because I didn't want him to ban me from doing whatever I was going to do next.
You're an example of a woman who has her own career. You don't need the patriarchy anymore. You could go off on your own, where maybe for some women, they feel trapped, like they don't have an education, they don't have a way of surviving after, getting a divorce. And so they stay in that position. So then did you want confirmation? Like, okay, I've done it, I'm resigned, but there's 1 in a million, but maybe I feel crazy. Am I crazy for thinking the church isn't true? Am I crazy? Am I the only one that knows what I know? And did you find a group? Did you find a home somewhere?
Yeah, I think it's a little, I think some people have this kind of journey, but it's not very, very common, I don't believe. But because I had been I was not a lazy learner my entire career in church.
You knew what quit Mormon was.
Yes, I did. I not only wanted to resign, I wanted to fireproof myself because all my family was still in. And I'm the oldest of 5 girls, plus step siblings who, I love, even though they're not really related anymore. But most of them were still Mormon. It was not popular that I left because I was kind of seen as the one that was really strong one. And so I went and took catechism classes for a year and became Catholic. I wanted to figure out the great abominable church, the horror of Christians. I wanted to go back to what I felt was the beginning of Christianity and figure it out. And that was one of the best ways. And I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore.
So you still had a belief in Jesus?
Absolutely.
Because you had developed your own relationship. You weren't letting the patriarchy dictate to you what God wanted for you. You weren't going to go to the bishop and tell him your problems and get his approval for you to do something. You had your own relationship with Jesus.
I was convinced, Jean, at that point that all the different paths that people were on religiously or spiritually were valid and is what they needed to get back to heaven.
I had a similar experience. So it used to be like there's one ladder going up the wall. And if you're not on the ladder, the Mormonism ladder, you're not going to make it to the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then I started thinking, well, maybe it's like a mountain and we can't see somebody on the other side. Or somebody's that you can see is away from you around the mountain. And they're on one hand, not on your path, but you can tell that they're still heading to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe it's okay for them to be on a different path, right? Because as long as they're going up the mountain, then they're okay.
Yeah. And it went back to the perfect parent scenario that I had in my head, because I would filter things through that.
So God would have a mountain to go to the top and not a ladder.
Well, he would know that all his children are different, and you parent your children differently to their need. If you're doing it by the evidence, which I was very into child education earlier in my career. And so I was like, of course there's different paths because there's different people. And so I really wanted to learn about Catholicism. I felt very drawn. And I did the catechism classes every Tuesday. One of my best friends at that time was a lifelong Catholic, and also somebody that was like aromantic, pansexual, kind of like a more liberal Catholic. And so she sat with me every Tuesday and we would talk, and it was the best deconstruction because I saw so many ways that Mormonism had taken Christianity, the dogma, the practices, the doctrines, the rituals, and twisted them into this different religion. And I saw threads everywhere from sacrament meeting all the way up to like celestial room, endowment things.
Now, did you ever read like Bart Ehrman or other scholars when you were this was helping you deconstruct Mormonism, but not religion when you were doing
100%. It also informed a lot of that deconstruction, but it was so helpful to see because growing up Mormon, people had told me my whole life that I was in a cult or I wasn't Christian, and of course we're like, no, I believe in Christ. But I realized that the Mormons are not what people think as Christians, because Mormons don't believe the same things at all. And it's not that I actually believed or didn't believe a lot of the new things I was learning about Catholicism, but it was so instructive and helpful for me to understand that difference between the Mormon take on it and what everyone else is thinking.
Right. It'd be like somebody saying, I believe in Star Wars, but the Federation is really in charge of everything. It's like, wait a minute, those are two different things, Star Trek and Star Wars. And Joseph Smith was like trying to merge both of them, into one thing. It's like, but the fans of each of those could say, no, that you're changing everything. So you are not Christians, right? The Catholics don't think Mormons are Christians. The Protestants don't think Mormons are Christians, because Joseph Smith tried to like weave his way and solve some problems here and some problems there, but it creates more problems, right? Eventually.
But I did love what I do appreciate about Catholicism still is I had so many questions and they were so patient with me. There was actually one of the deacons had been a Mormon.
Wow.
And had been on several different programs talking about Mormonism. And so he came and did some of the teachings. And I really appreciated that they didn't try to have an answer for everything. It's called the mysteries.
Right.
And it's just, we don't know, and it's okay not to know. And so that was the first time ever really been allowed to just feel that way, that it's okay not to know. Because in Mormonism, one of the things that I loved was that we had answers for everything. And I loved that I knew the answers.
So that's, in a way, that's a sign of a mature church, right? The Catholic Church. Like, here's the teachings. Do your best. If you have a question, we don't know. God's ways are mysterious, right? But these other things are good. And so we're glad to have you, right? You can believe that the communion doesn't become flesh and blood, upon, entering your body, that's okay. Right. I had thought also, there's another thing I think about, because I think about things, is that Catholics have had monks for over 1,000 years. And those monks, their jobs partly was to copy texts so that other churches could have texts, right? And it wasn't until the 1500s that they brought sort of everything in line, even though the 3rd and 4th centuries, they threw away some of the Gnostic teachings. They threw away some other things. You were a heretic if you didn't believe our ways. And so that's like the Mormon church now. If you don't believe this way, you're a heretic. You're out. You're excommunicated, right? And all these monks, they had to think of things. And so they had to explain how things worked in the Catholic Church. They had to do their own apologetics. So that's where apologetics actually comes from, was Catholic apologetics for 1,000 years, right?
And they're still at it.
they're still at it. And so they've been able to solve a lot of problems. And so that's why there's 1 billion Catholics. Now, it also helped when they joined up dominating the world with the conquistadors and other things. You convert a lot of people that way. At the same time, Captain Moroni did it to the kingmen. Like, do you believe in us now, or I'm going to kill you? It's like, okay, I believe in Mormonism. You get a lot of converts that way.
Yep.
So and so Mormon apologetics is only a few hundred years. It's not even 150 years old, we'll say. And B.H. Roberts might have been one of the first apologetic type persons, because anybody before B.H. Roberts was just preaching the way it was. This is the way it is. Parley P. Pratt, Brigham Young, everybody's like, this is what God wants, right? And then pretty soon B.H. Roberts is like, but the Book of Mormon it seems too fanciful of a tale. Maybe we should emphasize the pioneers, their struggles, their faith as a way of doing things. And they didn't want to do that. So they redoubled their efforts to be the answer to everybody. And Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce Armour Conkey took over the history department of the church. And they made sure everybody got a miracle at every step. God was in charge of the church every step of the way. And now history is proving something different. And it's causing people to do different things. And so you started hearing Radio Free Mormon and Bill Reel's show. Did you hear Bill Reel first or Radio Free Mormon?
John Dehlin.
All right. John Dehlin was first, right?
John Dehlin. And so in 2018, 2019, I was obsessed with two things: learning about narcissism and learning about church history. Because after I had left, I honestly don't remember. It was around the same time that I read the CES letter, but that didn't, like I said, that was not what influenced me. I wish I had read it whenever it first was published, because it would have saved me a lot of issues.
Right. And did you read it because Jeremy Reynolds was on Mormon Stories? Is that where you heard of the CES letter?
But I found John Dehlin probably from an algorithm. Mm-hmm. And because I wasn't in the Utah, I didn't see all of the stuff. I didn't know who he was. And then I deep dived like so many people. And the CES letter, I did listen to that interview. I read it. And I couldn't talk to anybody about it because I was the first person in my family really to publicly peace out of Mormonism. There were some inactive or less active people, but I was the one that was joining the Catholic Church and like, I'm never going
crazy things.
And so I just listened. And then I can't remember, I think RFM and Bill Reel, like there was some crossover, and RFM has the Rush Limbaugh vibe. And so because I had been so like, since I was in junior high school, I had been listening to Rush Limbaugh, and then I had stopped when I was an adult, when I was having my faith crisis stuff. Because that's my real faith crisis kicked off in 2016 when Trump got elected. But,
yeah, it's kind of like a salesperson who you also want to be friends with. You don't think that they're selling you anything bad. Their personality is friendly enough to want to accept it. So while RFM and Rush Limbaugh have totally different messages, there's a similar vibe in it. It's somebody who's telling you something, selling you some ideas, right? Setting the stage for these beliefs or whatever, and has a nice enough personality where you think, well, I'd like to be friends with that person too, right?
Yeah, but I love listening to people that are just very clever. And so all of these people that we've mentioned are so clever. And so I was just drawn to that. And
they have insights.
And the way that RFM had, as a lawyer's mind, broke down things, that tracked for me because I have I'm not neurotypical, I'm atypical, but I have this science background. And so that really tracks with me, that legal format.
Logical thinking.
Yes. So I got really interested and started deep diving Mormon discussion stuff too.
Right. So did COVID have an impact on you? So you were in healthcare. That means you had to work more.
I was, yep, I was in a huge hospital system in Idaho when COVID started. I was terrified that I would die and leave my kids without their mom. And so I changed jobs and became the dean of a nursing school.
Okay.
It was just opening up in Boise. And so that I could stay home and not have to. And I had a lot of shame about that too. And I went and talked to the priest. This is one of the only times I ever sought out clergy advice because I was having such guilt that I wasn't putting my life at risk. And I had some underlying health conditions that I was a higher risk. And I knew I'd get it if I was around the hospital. And the priest was so lovely. And I know that's not the experience that everyone has. There's a lot of issues with Catholicism. But he said I was being too hard on myself, that I needed to do what was right for my family. I was like, okay, and then that's when I was really thinking maybe Catholicism was the word of God.
Now,
So,
did you also seek out other therapeutic professional help?
oh yeah, I've been in therapy.
Okay. So you were sort of in therapy already because of being divorced and having other issues and family interpersonal relationships and stuff like that. But you hadn't really brought up as a main thing religion to those situations. You did the religion thing sort of to the priest, right?
Yeah. So I just deconstructed on my own. Like my therapy time at that point, like I made sure that I had a non-Mormon as a therapist, which is a little bit difficult in Idaho. And I said, she's like, well, let's talk about religion and I was like, religion's off the table. I want to talk about my relationship with my husband because I thought I was going crazy. So it wasn't until a few years later that I actually started really deconstructing with my therapist about my experiences. And I did EMDR, which I don't know if you are familiar with that.
I've heard of it.
For me, it changed everything.
We did couples counseling that was emotionally focused therapy, EFT. And so that gave us a vocabulary that we could use to like diffuse some otherwise tense situations, to think about how we were making a rut in a path, doing the same circular arguments all the time. So I understand that certain things fit different people's situations. And
yeah. So EMDR is really, really good for PTSD situations.
So then you were an observer of podcasts, and here comes the teaser after finally you decide to start writing a book. Did you start, were you journaling? Were you doing other things along the way? Had you thought about writing other books? Had you thought about other things? And then all of a sudden it's like, I should write a book about my life experience with Mormonism or something like that. How did that happen?
Well, I have been a writer since I could write. My mom used to staple together pieces of paper into little booklets. Like she would cut it up and there'd be little booklets and I would write. I love writing. But women didn't pursue careers in, when I was growing up, and I happened to be, go into this nursing thing as a survival thing in my.
So are you saying that perhaps if you hadn't gotten pregnant and been encouraged to be married and have kids, and that the end of the world wasn't coming, you might have been an English major and explored a career in that field, sort of?
I would have loved that. And everybody that knew me knew that I loved writing. I would give speeches and are writing, like essay writing contests all the time. And so that was my jam. So I did have this passion for writing. And I originally started writing a book about how to be successful in your career as a woman, with a very Mormon perspective. Yeah.
Okay.
So I started writing that, and then I had changed so much by that point. It was around 2018, 2019. I looked at what I had already written, and I was like, this is not the book I want to write. What I want to write is a book about because I had been raised in this high control, high demand church, and I was in a high control, high demand relationship. One of the people because I remember I said that I was obsessed with narcissism, trying
Right.
to learn about that, and then church, and then that led me to discover Dr. Stephen Hassan.
Hassan. Mm-hmm.
And I read his works, and I was like, everyone needs to hear this. Everyone needs to understand this. And
the focus of the book isn't necessarily anti framework for being in an organization. It just wants to highlight things that are probably negative if there's too much demands going on.
mm-hmm.
Like there are good cults, like people that buy Apple products might be in a cult, but it's not a bad cult to be in, right? They don't force you to do anything, but certainly lots of the people that have Apple products do become evangelists for their products.
I know,
but
I'm an Apple person too.
It still doesn't mean you're going to not go to heaven if you buy a PC. It just means it might have features that you need that Apple doesn't provide or whatever. But there are things to look for, like does the organization demand that you not have your own identity? Does it demand that you be like part of a cog somewhere? Almost like the Borg is the perfect example of the worst cult you could ever be in, because they were like assimilate or die.
Yep. And I had at that time too, I had watched Leah Remini's Scientology series.
Oh, right.
And so and through that, I started recognizing, because I had this idea, Mormonism at its base fundamentally is benign.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing Scientology and being open, and she did also, I think, a Jehovah's Witness episode, and seeing the same tactics, the same things that I felt, the same behaviors reflected in that, made me be able to deconstruct and give myself a break, basically, about a lot of things. Mormonism, like
there's so many things that are similar, but they're extra in these other things. Like people would say, oh, Mormons are a cult, just like Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses. And you'd say, no, those guys are the crazy ones. We're the nice religion. We're not a cult, right?
Just have better press.
Yeah. So you have to change the direction of your book.
Yep. So I changed it. I threw out that other stuff. I knew that I was writing this book, not really my audience isn't really Mormons, because they're not going to listen to me. Anything I say, they're not going to really. I'm an apostate, literally. So my goal, my audience is really anybody that wants to learn about a little bit about Mormonism and how that the bite model is expressed in Mormonism, in my perspective, in my experience. And my goal is to help people that maybe that are ex-Mormon, to, much like Dr. Hassan, because he is my unknown mentor. He doesn't know he's my mentor, but he definitely is how do you stay connected and feed these people information? And how do you recognize that you are in this high demand, high control relationship or organization? Like, what are the red flags? And one of the things that through writing this book, I realized it is so easy to fall right back into another high control, high demand relationship because it feels comfortable. I got married. I was married briefly for just under 3 years after I was divorced from my first husband. And it felt so comfortable and familiar because that's what I was used to. But I recognized it a lot faster the second time. So I was able to be like, no, this is not for me.
Right. And so Stephen Hassan had his family do an intervention where they like kidnapped him almost and had him in a room for 3 days and was trying to tell him, here's all the bad things about Mooney, the Mooney Church, the Unification Church, right? And so that is not something you would think needed to be done to your relatives at all, right? They just need to hear and listen and think. But just like anything else, if they hear something bad, just like when you saw Joseph Smith practice polygamy, they want to shut it. And that's from Satan. It's going to destroy my testimony. So I don't want to go there. There's so much importance of, the afterlife, and, so many things are riding on it without really good proof. Right. But since they're already indoctrinated, it's just the main thing is in medical services, we have consent, right? Informed consent. In real estate, there is full disclosure. You have to disclose if the foundation has cracks in it or somebody was murdered at your house or something like that, because those things are big and they're impactful and people need that information to make such big choices. And yet, why not where eternity is involved, right? Why not gain a more full disclosure? Why not have informed consent? And so that is probably going to be what your book is going to do, is going to provide for some people that will listen.
Right. And so what I think of this book as, of course, is my first one. So it's a lot. It's not great. But
you got to do it. You got to start somewhere.
Yes. And what really helped me was hearing over and over different people's stories, because I would hear something from this person, and it helped bolster me up because, like I said before, I was so alone in that journey.
And you can find virtual community in everybody else's stories.
And so if I can just be that, one little piece for somebody, this one book is not going to solve any of your problems. It would be a miracle. But it's just one more testament to add to the other testaments. And we need more stories.
It's just like when every member's a missionary. You never know how many plates of cookies a non-member needs to have until they say yes to the missionaries when they come knocking on their door. Right? It's the same type of thing. You need, in order to break a habit, you have to do something else for, 21 days in a row. In order to learn things, you need to do thousands of hours, right? So it's the same kind of thing in order to be an expert in something. So anyhow, Carrie, do you want to say what the name of your book is, or should we tease it for the next episode, or what?
It's called Goodbye Magic Undies.
There you go.
And it's how I say goodbye to my magic undies, which, as you heard earlier, I was so thrilled to get in the beginning. So that's kind of the thread throughout the book. And it's very, I feel like we're having a conversation through most of the book. I'm very transparent about a lot of things, especially about the mistakes I made, because I want people to hear, because as a Mormon, when you leave Mormonism, you are, just as you said, Jean, a missionary. And I try to convert all of my loved ones to my new understanding. And I made so many mistakes. I strained so many relationships, and I made people feel so sad. And I did it, and I knew how it felt. And so when I started seeing what I was doing, I stepped back because I had been a Mormon so recently. I knew what I was doing to them was done to me, and how I had pushed back so hard on people like that. So I just stopped talking about it, and I started learning, and then I started writing.
And your book is going to come out early in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll have you back on maybe in January, and we'll have people learn more about your book and more about how they can do a pre-order in anticipation of its publication date. And thanks everybody for watching. Thanks, Carrie, for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
And if I ever get Dr. Hassan on, I'll have you be my co-host. How about that?
Oh my gosh, I would love that.
I have to start working on it a little bit harder. I'm connected to him a little bit. I follow his Facebook page. I comment every now and then. And so it's time for me to be more proactive.
Well, I took his clinical course for counseling former cult members. I recommend it to anybody. He has 2 versions. He has the clinical course one. This is now a commercial for him. Sorry, Gene. But which is the one I took because I wanted the credit hours. But then he has a less expensive one. It's just for general interest. I recommend it to everybody. It was so helpful to me to know how to talk to people.
So we actually neglected something. It says Dr. Carrie Sweet. And so when did you become, and what is that degree?
So I went and got my bachelor's degree in Pensacola, Florida. And then 2 years later, I went back to get my master's degree. And I went for a year because I wanted to be a midwife really extremely. But I had a really difficult time getting clinical placement. And I found that I had another passion for a clinical nurse specialist, which is an advanced practice nurse. And they look at systems, nursing practice, and also their providers.
Like nurse theory, sort of.
Yes. So it's like everything. And so it's like being a nerd of nurses, basically. So I got that. And I got a dual master's degree in clinical nurse specialist, advanced practice nursing, and then also in nurse education. While I was in school, I had this dream that I could, because I was still trying to work part-time. So I could probably do part-time professor, but to do that, I need a doctorate. So if like 5 years after that, in like 2015, I went and I got my doctorate in nursing in advanced practice nursing. So I've been to all the school.
What was that educational facility called that you became a doctor in?
So my master's degrees are from University of Cincinnati. My bachelor's degree is University of West Florida. And then Chamberlain College of Nursing is where I got my doctorate.
Okay. So anyway,
my doctoral thing was all about increasing autonomy for pregnant women.
There you go. It's almost like the American with Disability Act, where you're not really disabled, you're just pregnant. So there's also more to the story that we will talk about, things that inspire you to keep on going and plugging away at the book, that we will talk about when we bring you back in a month and a half, maybe, or something like that.
Sounds great.
And so thanks everyone for watching again, and like and subscribe, do all the things, and have a great rest of the year.